All right. So, a few seconds there, kind of thing. Get my beanie off. Get hoodie, zip up hoodie off. Still pretty warm, to be honest. And this was one hell of a walk, and now I have to go ride my bike all the way back home. It's actually genuinely difficult. And they're like, "Oh, you have an e-bike. It's not that hard." And I'm like, sure. I know. It's like, you just told us a bike. You never said e-bike. No, I said e-bike on my YouTube and all this other shit many times. So anyways, point is, this is a wonderful design, but shit in basically every way for me. Other people, they're maybe not very well informed, or maybe they are, but they just don't understand why I feel like my design is shit. It's not hitting the characteristics I'm looking for. I'm burning too much energy for a non-amplified effect of the fluid that I'm in. I'm not doing it efficiently, effectively, or really practically anything. I'm being honest. Like, I'm not. It's like, this is kind of silly. This is kind of stupid. This is like kind of a stupid design. It's like, yeah, to a degree I started something. I'm basically just making a huge fucking jet engine in multiple areas along wings to basically kind of gain a slight advantage. Yeah. You know what I mean? It's kind of stupid, and now my wings weigh a lot, and I just don't like it. It's just annoying. And where'd the fuel go? They're like, oh, hey, let me just have my fuel right next to my freaking jet engines. My hydraulic fluid, which is flammable, alongside of my fuselage, which is going to have so much great fuel. You know, that kind of thing. Look at all this fuel. Yeah, I heard you like fuel. I figured you like fucking being a fuel happy, fuel consumer, fuel. You get it, right? So, anyways. It's like, okay, so how do I make this better? Effectively, is what I had to start learning how to do. And I went back to drawing board on wing designs and efficiency of turbines, and how to design greater and greater degrees of efficiency. And now we have the vacuum. That's how that one of those vacuum designs started appearing for the turboprop sort of thing, along with the inside intake and the exhaust kind of being used to create a jet engine sort of thing with the extra air that is now available to us, you know, which is great. It's, you know, mostly just a prop, not really creating that much thrust, but, you know, it's not like I want, you know, not trying to be tsundere, but it was like, this is just really mostly to make it more efficient to have a rear moving part become more efficient, you know, with a ram air style, basically, Bernoulli system, Bernoulli system, you know, that creates the added benefit of the turbo, or the props, giving me an increased intake for the next area, which then, of course, has pressurized, thanks to exhaust gases, giving me a measurable degree with the correct setup to create a compression area that's easier with the Venturi, not Bernoulli, the Bernoulli's principle, to make the necessary, you know, compression ignition happen sooner, you know, without like a exhaust gas doing it. But of course I have exhaust gas, so, you know, why not make it more efficient, sort of thing ish. But then it was like, right, it's cool, but it's not. You know, it's wonderful for like a Cessna, you know what I mean, or like a regular commercial airplane, you know, like it's wonderful for that, yeah. Like it basically makes them much better at doing their job with like less fuel use, energy overhead from an earlier point in its flight characteristic pass, saving on fuel and hydrocarbon use. And the way it does it too is also very nice, because then you also have a secondary afterburner area that effectively just dump water into it and give it some time to, from its decompositional state, create a very nice degree of exothermic energy release and pressure increase for its given intended flight application characteristics, which is more efficient, yeah, but it's not exactly you get some from nothing, you know what I mean? Water does its thing. It cleans up a lot of the hydrocarbon particulates, that tend to float down eventually. And it tends to also help with thrust, because you're using the water to gain a measurable increase of thrust. And so outright overall, there's less hydrocarbon necessary. And you can always collect, thanks to humidity in the air, a somewhat amount of water from your passengers and the air that you're traveling through. Same thing with urine. If you're unaware or uninitiated, filtering a little bit of urine and dumping it into your exhaust loses the weight. It loses the weight so significantly that it actually helps you maintain fuel efficiencies. Alongside of, if you can treat your fecal matter a little, dry it, because you have the need to dump that, water into your exhaust, you have a way of burning in the more decompositional area some of that carbon and other organic material into a secondary fuel. So you can use less fuel, and then you still have water with less water, you know what I mean? So you're more balanced on your energy demands by doing that, to actually move passenger plane people around. Cargo, of course, is a little different. They don't get this benefit of having people breathe out this stuff called carbon dioxide and water, respectively, or sweat it, or spittle, I suppose, But then it's also another wonderful design right here, where we're air drying, essentially, with a little bit of, scoops and some basic sunlight, I guess, reflector, or, heat, residual heat from the planes. You can gain a very speedy carbonization of our, fecal matter. And filtration of urine isn't as necessary as you might expect, but it usually just means longer longevity for injectors and other, areas after the injector, because there are ammoniums, nitrates, salts, potassiums, lithium, all this stuff. So, it's like, yes, you get a greater degree of efficiency, but there needs to be a decent coating on the inside for it that allows for the exhaust to not be a trouble to the housing of the jet engine, respectively. So that's kind of where it tends to be like, yeah, that's a cool design, but where are we going with like your other design? Right. So sorry. Oop, there's the cattle thing. All right, now, right. Whew. Because it's like, we're looking for helicopters here. And it's like, right, the helicopter is coming. The worst part about the helicopter design is I had to basically make caveats everywhere. There's no one perfect anything kind of stuff on that shit, which kind of fucking sucks in a lot of ways. So I had to combine the best of several things that I know of and, take that for what it is, because I'm not perfectly knowledgeable on all the things like I would like to be. All that is to say, the big old blade at the top now is a weird old blade that is very, very odd to, like, I think anyone who knows how helicopters work. It's smaller, but more efficient than it should ever be. All right, now to put this in perspective, I increased its interactional, meaning surface area contact with the fluid that we're traveling through. Just like I talked about a little bit before, except now we need to make it different, because I have a fuselage and I have wings. And so the fuselage is left alone. I don't want it to be touched. That bothers me. I hate fuselage parts, essentially. Anything above it, it's just spinning vortex of choppy doom thing. And I don't like it. So that's basically where that. Oh, hey, look at the big old elk. Hey there, elks. There, elks. Look at you. All right. Use it. Bumpy ass fucking road. Right. Focus. So we need to do the version of a sideways Chinook. Okay. Sideways Chinook. Yeah. Big old truck drove right past me. Anyways, sideways Chinook shenanigans. So I already have one of those helicopters, but the difference between that and this is what you might expect. Because the fuselage is now a little more, less fuselage-y, a little more, I'm definitely, for sure, next to an engine. Like, there's no doubt about that. There's nothing I can say other than that's an engine right there. Plunk, plunk. This guy can do so much. Remember, birds do it best. Hollow is nice. Fragile is unfortunately something that has to be done. Now that inside engine is wonderfully helped out with these blades on these sides that are, well, just like an Osprey, if I'm going to be really realistic, kind of, but kind of not. Okay? Wherein you would think that they would be the same kind of thing. They're really just 3 different blades. At least this is a decent way to say it. They're screw things and blades. I know, right? And they work off of a cylindrical joint, like our hip joint style axle. So when they spin, they can rotate much more easily. Oy, oy, oy. Yeah. Now these things are cool. Really, honestly, very, very cool. Because those joint areas are also the wonderfully designed, structurally supported, each for the outside and for the blades that are on the outside of it, and the inside of it, they're hollow. I have, of course, never stopped continuing the inside engine to outside parameters for jet engines because they are the most simplistic design for any compressor style jet engine. So they each are their own version of an intake, an exhaust, compressor, and all the rest of that I just talked about in my previous recording. The main difference is that there's a central engine that happens to be very, very good at keeping everything fed. For the most part, it's not much more than a compressor for the front, rear, middle and rear engine and exhaust and dually combo air fuel compressor, all that stuff. The difference here is in how it utilizes a basic, easy shapes to make a significant measurable change in its profile for fluid flow, which is to say, the Japanese art of folding thing, origami, which is another version of my, once we get it up and running, it produces a fluidic flow for the hydraulic fluid, which is mass, but also that mass is tied to the fan blades, which are then being resisted to stop and slow down by the expanding hot combustion gases and exhaust gases, and then helped out by continuation of flow into the intake area, respectively. Okay, now it turns the entirety of a quote-unquote helicopter into a ginormous lifting body characteristic, wing, and also jet engine thrust. Just like I was talking about a little earlier, I had to basically redesign this into, it kind of looks a little bit like a flying saucer. If I'm going to be realistic about it, it's not, but it kind of, sort of, somewhat does. You know, look at it at the right angle, you might imagine it to be something like that. And you blurry and, you know, all that, and you might actually think that's the case. But we're going to go with, okay, so it's kind of like a delta wing or something. It's a helicopter, kind of have to make it a helicopter. There's no getting around the helicopter nature of the helicopter. It's more of a double teardrop almost kind of style that hasn't just moved some stuff around. And it makes a bunch of lifting body characteristics immediately occur from the intake, from the, you know, sides, direction of travel, you know, which is going to be front, rear, and sides, and top, respectively. Then it creates a wonderful lift characteristic as it sucks it in on one side, where the engines are now creating a ginormous degree of increased pressure and density compared to the vacuum it forms as it sucks this in and alters it through the use of the hydraulic ram and fluid flow movement. Let me see here. Now, we have to describe this shape because it's like, what the fuck did you just say? Think three-dimensionally instead of two-dimensional into a three-dimensional shape. We're going to take a three-dimensional shape and alter its characteristics into what is effectively a triple or bi-wing design with a couple of domes, more or less. that create extraordinarily powerful vortexes. Like, very strong, that combine and then are, because of that spinning vortexing effect, produce compression that then adds that velocity and compression characteristic into ease of the flow and compression and subsequent igniting of the fuel for the props, which are of course going to use the vacuum area design that I talked about earlier, except now we're going to be using a really, really strong vacuum that's basically at the top, all along the top surface, and we have the ability with some slight altering of the structure to create a forward travel with just vacuum in front of one area versus another. So it has up, it can always reduce thrust for down, and it has all 360-degree travel fairly quickly, because it can always angle itself kind of like a literal rocket engine. Now, these domes and these panels are, of course, very, very, very lightweight and fragile, but not super fragile. They are structurally very supportive, strong, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, but you don't want to fucking break it by crashing. They'll break when you do. So, you know, if you think you're going to hurt, that's going to hurt too. Granted, it's meant to ablate or crunch and crush and have things fly off / away / bend and crunch in specific ways to allow for a dissipation of energy for the people inside. You know, the kind of, we're trying to design how to basically make it so you survive a crash. So I'd rather you survive than the aircraft itself. It's an old elementary school science experiment where they give you an egg and say, design how to make it not break after dropping it from this height. That kind of thing. And that's just all it is. So a hydraulic fluid has a venting pressurized air system, pneumatic, along with the fluid itself having baffles, all to go and be vented out upon overpressurization and continued breaking down of redundant systems that it bypasses into should something break or fail. So now these domes are a wonderful, beautiful design. They're not hollow technically, you know what I mean? Like, they're just domes, but like they're also set up to have a pattern of space in between them. That way, as air starts to travel, it skips over and it creates a version of a vortex. If you do this correctly, you create a strengthening of a Venturi effect and vortexing spinning effect that also increases its flow rate and direction of travel speed, velocity, airspeed, while also producing a incredibly measurable, strong lift vacuum in the center of the quote-unquote dome kind of thing area. Now, it only works up to a certain speed, and of course, if you ever figure out a way to, know about valves, then you'll know that there's a way to create a version of this vortexing that is going to be utilized to create a high pressure system that essentially creates a valve that bifurcates this vortexing and slides it along a boundary layer, which then adds itself to the vortexing somewhere else, increasing the vortexing and speed and pressure and separation of the air inside, because it's basically still stuck to this other air that's traveling that direction. A good way to put that is, it's a good question. It works, it's just very specific how you have to do it, and I don't like it. Which is why it's like we're going through the rundown of how I got to the inevitable, like this is what it is that you should do thing, because I've kind of forgotten that I didn't have like a way to just boom. So that I'm trying to just kind of make it up too. Might as well. I mean, I'm pretty good at brute forcing as I go along and designing as I do. So nothing saying that I can't trigger memories and also design at the same time. You know. So, moving on. Now we're going to go into the dome area / wing sort of thing. Remember, these have to skip that air into these dome areas, and those dome areas have to skip the air into the intake. And the side area, of course, are bifurcating and creating the lower pressure underneath and the higher pressure above. And so these are very strong supportive structures that are opening up that then lift, okay, the whole thing, kind of like a parachute in a lot of ways. All right, because it's creating baffles inside that are effectively very, very good at increasing the extremely great concentrated flow, is what I suppose some people might describe that as, because it's like the flow is very much unilaterally just forced into these engines in all directions, regardless of wind travel. It might stall or whatever else, but like that's basically all it does. Now, we can't like do some perfect thing. Remember that. So instead of trying to create something that is borderline fuck you, kind of like how many little tiny moving parts and shit are you gonna add? Damn bastard. You know what I mean? So it's like there's a triple. There's a reason why it's triple to buy. Buy is like that one thing. Triple is kind of harder, but it's kind of also not, because it makes it a lot easier to produce a effect that we're looking for when it comes down to shaping our air. And then there's the hybrid 2.5, where there's some 3 and there's some 2, that kind of thing. Which it's like, that one's usually not gonna be as good as like certain versions, you know what I mean? Like, it's just what it is. You can never get around the fact that it's like, you sacrifice a lot often with hybrid designs, unless you can make up for it or somewhere else. So, you get into these wing area tips that are vortex inducer that are also separator valve things. Right? And so it's like this triple / 2 / you know, okay, let's just go with the 2. All right, we'll separate that. It's like, first off, the intakes is really only one side. You know, like once you get your engine going, rotated, traveling the direction you're traveling, and it's now just more of an airplane. Okay, you know, it's one side that you will do this for. So this is a sort of flexible material, but it's not really the flexibility that I'm looking for. In fact, it's not that flexible for being reasonable about it, but it is. It's stiff, it's flexible. I want to move off of it. So the rotation of the engines and the blades that are inside of that tube, okay, and all that jazz, which, my gosh, I had to really break this down for them Because it's like, oh, I can easily see this. Like, how do I describe that? Like, in my head, it's working. It's like, I don't know how to... It's like, I already got it, you know what I mean? Anyways, we're going to create these vacuum vortices. Let's start with the top wing layer. Okay, like, then we'll get into the engine and mechanics of how it changes, how it's actually just fine, and while a little heavier, it's worth it. That kind of thing. You know, to a point, because, you know, if I didn't have to use that and just use the material for the regular thing, I wouldn't have the same weight that you do, but then, you know, older style materials, blah, blah, blah. You know, that whole stuff. But, let's see here. Top wing, gotta do the whole, what is it again? The stupid stator thing. Basically just starts curving things in a boundary layer, dimpling it. So stagnating. Yeah. So we're gonna stall with a vortex, you know, in a particular pattern that's consistently in these areas, that then allows for that vortex to be further increased and then essentially create a string. It's the log vortex I was talking about that trails all the way back to the outside part for the engine, and combustion and all that is occurring, because as it goes into the engine, it's going to create a stronger and stronger rotational vortex, kind of like a tornado. That is, again, it's just that intake area sort of wing thing. It's like, at first it's like a basic intake area wing thing that is then, let's see here, intake area wing. All right, so the stalling vortex then creates that, which creates the initial sort of lift. But of course, as you get the engines up and running and there's a greater and greater degree of vacuum, of course it will try and get sucked in for that. So you have to manage that by creating what is effectively, for those engines, that other air intake for the center, that is the combustion area for the first part, that starts the prop design that's in the front and the rear, respectively. That will then give you your going uphill, front and rear, respectively, that are doing a good amount of work, because they're fairly wide, but then they're not that wide. You know what I mean? Like, the fronts are wider than the middles, and the middles are wider than the rears. They can change their blade angles very specifically. Again, it's only certain applications this will ever be used under. So, as a result, it's like, technically there's two there, right? And I'm like, well, not really, no, but then kind of yes. Give me a second. Give me a second. Yeah, exactly. There's. Give me a second. You've already jumped ahead of the class there, dude. But you're correct. We have stators at the rear for the exhaust, for the vertical hovering floating mode. Okay, which means we're going to take that exhaust, that's coming off the middle of that vacuum, which is kind of being created by the rotation of the hip joint kind of area, that is also still intaking for the vacuum area, which is now a double rotating vacuum. It's like a bunch of column of rotating vacuums, that's in the inside, and then there's another one on the outside, and then there's, of course, the barely any actual air in between that as well, in a lot of ways. In comparison to the hyper concentrated vortex that's flowing as fast as it can because that's the least amount of resistance compared to that area. So it's like, well, if you look at it from the perspective of that in between these vortexing areas that are in the center, okay, and the outer area, you know, that's much higher pressure, even though it's very little, compared to the extremely high flow rate, that's very efficient flow rate too, vortexes that are in the, you know, vortexes, effectively. And they are going into the intake blade prop areas. Let's see here. Now, we do have, of course, the caveat in the room, which is the hip joints have to move, and so those have to kind of separate and allow for those blades to not ultimately interact in a negative profile way, which means like the in-between for the larger, middle, small fan blades actually help to create a exhaust gas blade area interactional profile with these stator blades. Okay, so those stator blades that are statically fixed once this moves and aligns itself, that inside engine then exhausts mostly into these stator blades. These stator blades aren't going to create anything other than a realignment of the exhaust gases and comboing and reduced back pressure flow. Essentially, we're just making really high flow rate gases. Like, it's almost like we're creating a linear generator with a bunch of fan blades for exhaust gases that spreads them in a comboed way. You know, like multiple teardrops will eventually touch each other, and then they're a big old glob. Kind of similar. I think several kind of jets that didn't really stall, they kind of like tend to constantly flow a specific amount, thrust. That's what that is, the exhaust gas, flow rate. That is also a very significant. You see here, as it creates a version of its stalled vortexing. So that's, I think, the fluid dynamics speak for. It has this curved vortex that's, working off of the exhaust and the, intake fan blade areas, and then the, interactional, they're not going to touch or hit, but they compress that air alongside of, then add the less compressed but comparatively much higher flow rate, center out into that compressed air with the mixture of the hot exhaust gases that then will then mix together with the stators. Now, right, a whole bunch of stuff. Now, see this outside area that is rotating, because it's easy enough to put a bearing on the housing of that, which we would have, no matter what, it's just moving it in particular 90-degree fashion. So you put that there and then lock it in based upon where it is within inside of the angle of rotation, with also the fluting necessary to allow for the good old-fashioned bearings to lock into place and be held, and then rotate the whole big old thing, with the now other engines being what is essentially free floating, and then made to help with the exhaust gases and the rotations be added into the props. So, like, those props on the outside are going to be spinning based upon the rotation and expansion and all that compression stuff from the inside engine turbine, I suppose, what you call it. And then that spins those props, which then also has the exhaust gases, which then creates a measurable degree of difference of pressure, but then it gets added to in these very specific areas that are going to then be essentially mixed together with a little bit of fuel and then pushed into a stator area as they wick essentially the fuel out of those stator areas in a kind of carb-like fashion, because it's kind of slightly stalling the vortex. So the vortex is technically giving up its speed for direction of travel speed in another way. But because it's doing that, it has a very specific characteristic where it technically is stalling while it's mixing and vortexing the air and gas. Like, you can kind of think about it in like a couple of different ways. It's vortexing, it's stalling, it's changed its direction, and for giving up a degree of the heat that is there, which is now the heat imparted into fuel, which that fuel now then imparts a exothermic excitation of fuel, and therefore pressure is regained and basically creates little micro pockets of combustion. But then also those pockets tend to fire off into the vortex and flow with the old Joule effect, as they are higher pressure and those are lower pressure, even though they are to us extremely high pressure. That then goes into a nice old combinationing effect, which is we're going to mix those multiple kind of styles of directed flow into one big, contiguous, ginormous, somewhat exhaust area that pretty much gets its entire support from a ginormous, huge body that prevents it from having air from anything other than the top, producing a measurable degree of velocity of flow into the intake, and you get the picture. But it's the stator vanes, which are like, what are those made of? Well, they're not graphite, I'll tell you that much. And again, they have fuel in there. Fuel tends to bubble and vaporize. That tends to make it essentially a pressurized fuel from the turbo prop, which is a prop kind of their own version of a, well, we have extremely high flow rate and pressure in a large amount of ways, and it's highly efficient because the vacuuming effect, the returling effect, effectively, that then like has a resistance, kind of like the Tesla valve, into the intake area. So there's no backflow problem, hopefully. Again, my designs don't have that issue, but I'll have to get into it because it's like, this one's a tricky bit of business. Like, the bifurcating thing is like, how the hell does it do that? I have to lift up the rear to allow it to flow those blades, basically. And it's like, you're right, I know that, but there's a middle part that it lifts up, which means it allows for the blades to be, for the tips for the sides to be covered, which allows for separation between the downward direction and the intake directional air, respectively. Which is a great thing. But that means it also intakes at the side. Oh no, you okay? You okay there, Phaser? Sorry there, buddy. Whew. I'm sorry. He tried to run in really hard. Almost got squished by my bike. Oh my gosh. Careful. Next time, he freaks out every time he has to go through that trailer ride. Yeah. Alright, so now the blade parts are changed because the sides now need to
again, that's a blade angle, all these things, where they have to stick into or slot into like little grooves, essentially, channels for and they are the spirally, vacuumy style of kind of blade things that I usually do, because they are much more efficient in creating extremely good differences in pressure, um, because they hold a vortex that uses the boundary layer very, very effectively to form a continuation of the vortex and an imparting of that vortex's energy in the pressure differentials, like Stirling engine usually says, as it moves and intakes more, a greater and greater degree of pressure, mass airflow, all that stuff, creating a greater and greater degree of suction in one direction versus another. That's all any fluid dynamic engine really does, or any jet, or any of it, really. So it's really hard to talk about it, because it's like Stirling is basically like really good about describing how thermodynamics works, but like he doesn't really kind of see, it seems like kind of missed the mark in my perspective on how it is the designs could have been improved drastically through the use of some basic continuation of the fluid's properties being balanced to be very, very efficiently handled and continued and amplified, thanks to really we only have a compressible Newtonian fluid called our atmosphere. So as a result, it's only so good to have some blade angles that are whatever they are. To me, that's like cheaping out on the very properties that make them work. If you don't use the boundary layer, if you don't use a vortex, if you don't use that very vortex, got my keys, to increase the design's efficiency as it gets into operating RPM range, then it's kind of a not great design, because it's not being managed and done in a way where it handles the very effect it's trying to use for work in a efficient and powerful manner that will allow for the amplification of the very effect you're looking to get. So, oh, that fell. Where did that fall? Anyways, yeah, I knocked over my router, which has my my bunny rabbit on the left for an A, my squirrel, orange. So bunny rabbit's white bunny rabbit. It's on the A side. It's on the left. The B side is a squirrel, which is orange. Okay, and then the right side is red, which is a bear. Okay, which is C. All right, and so like there's an old question that was posed. Don't worry, it kind of actually does tie into this. So give me a second. So the see here, squirrel, in my current belief of what's going on and all the stuff that's happening, is the thing that I have, this ring I picked up off the street while I was walking and homeless. Now it's a cheap knockoff kind of like you could use it. It's really not like a real like there's no diamonds, and fake pearls. It's some cheap ass metal. I don't even know what it is, but it's probably not gonna hurt you. It's probably like steel or some zinc or some shit. Like whatever that is, right? But anyways, it's around the neck of the squirrel because it's like kind of the only thing I can actually put it on. Because like the bunny rabbit's a big blobby thing, and so is the bear. So as a result, I can't really put it on anything. I can place it on there. I don't mind. It's supposed to be symbolic because I have this home camera. It's a little elf smart home camera that I'm always like tweeting out on my Xenon Reality Twitter and my Xenon Reality Color Reddit. The share link, like if you get the app that they have for it, like then you're able to watch the home camera, which is just fine. I'm okay with that. That's kind of the whole point. I don't really mind, and yes, they can see naughty things sometimes. So that kind of stuff. But which again, I'm not really. I don't care. That's kind of what that is. That being said, it ties into the whole like fan blade thingy, where it's like that's if you know about my tweets, then it's like A is creator, programmer, entertainment kind of thing. B is the corporations, kind of thing, and then C is government, politician kind of stuff because they're broke. C, so I'll get into that because it's like A has money, but they're not broke, and they're usually the original creators of something. B is usually the one that does it best, and orange is greedy, white is seemingly neutral or good or whatever. This is kind of like a white-blue for the creator thing. Then there's red, which is the bear, which is like, to do with you're broke. C is like the government's shit tons of debt. So, and always climbing and making more. So, and A is, which means it's like it's the poorest. You know what I mean? And B, while it does it best, didn't create it, but they do it best. And C is just the poorest, which is the argument of the ABC. You're going to give something to your one of your three children or some shit like that. And A is the creator, B is the one that does it best, and C is the poorest. Which one do you choose? It's a psychological test. So it's like, I'm, gonna, and it's like, because that's kind of what it is. But what it means for me is like creating the initial intake parameter and vacuum and all the rest of it. The B does it best from compressing and managing, modifying, directing, all this stuff, basically. And then C is the exhaust, which is the poorest, because it's like I effectively went maximum intrapedic value to gain a degree of effect. So that's why it ties into the engine, even if you might not understand. So you create it at first, you manage it a lot, and then you exhaust it the correct way, and you get a very good, significant, lifting body characteristic effect. So it's also making the intake effectively a lifting body characteristic, but also intake characteristic, intake management and modification characteristic into the compression, calculated, all that stuff characteristic that the and compression, combustion, exhaust, which then the exhaust then gets further added to with a little bit of fuel, okay, but then also that actually just modifies the exhaust while it combines and all this other stuff into a, well, comparatively less dense than the above onrush of air. Which I get it. Like, it's like, what the hell? Why is it less dense? And it's because it's very, very hot, very, very fast moving flow, and it's managed with a ginormous body that effectively kind of like, because it's spreading out. And right. So it's like, it's going to separate, bifurcate, more or less, make two pieces. That second part, along with the rotation, then creates a genuine stator area, but that stator area then is also sort of slightly concentrating it, but also directing it in a very specific, way, very laminaristic characteristic, all one-way direction. Then it's also going to expand, and so then it has like a little bit of a skirt. I can't do much, but like a little bit of a skirt, because I can then a little bit of a skirt, a couple skirt things that like a lobster tail slide into each other, and like that's a cone more or less, baffle, bell end stuff, that kind of thing, or shroud, sorry, not baffle. Yeah, right. Which gives it a little bit of extra oomph, more or less, because again, it's the lifting body characteristic that is what's creating our actual thrust. And again, we're using very little fuel for the effect to be done. See, this intake modification management system, once it gets up to the correct RPM, is using my vacuum blade and area system to very, very maximal effect. Because the sidewall intake, that creates its own version of like, okay, so then that's going to be added to with the vortexing, compressed, kind of like going to then add itself into this outside intake from the two that are there. And then the main central area, of course, has the majority of where that vacuum effect is, and that's going to go into the medium area fan blade, or medium size, fan blades. But again, hold your horses, because it's like there are different size fan blades here. Why is it all very similar? And I totally get you on that one. It all comes down to how the size of the area and intake and ultimate resultive effects for how much the fan blades interact, and the housing around them, and the lifting and ultimate change internally changes its size of the tube, essentially, that they're all adding the air into, and sharing this flow rate and compression into each one of themselves, each one of the different blades, that is, or props, yeah, and the central air intake engines that are doing a lot of that work as well. So, which are actually all the same size. I know that sounds like that would be a waste, but give it a second. They all have to be functionally the same size, because that's the tube that's in, when you get going forward, that's the tube that's taking in all the air that you need to have. Give it a second, though. Right. Now, that side, that's the forward facing side is already open. It has to be already open, but it's going to change to basically try and direct airflow from the sides of the big ginormous kind of prop, okay, to being like directed, okay, but it's not all going to be directed only into this one, same equivalent, sized area. That has to be separated and then moved over into the rear to be added to further help it gain advantages to efficiencies. And it's a big old plenum volume, and if you do it correctly, the right boundary layers and kind of separators, tubes essentially. And again, it's like creating tunnels essentially with inside of it. They're really small, but they're not really that small. Like they got a big area for volume, but then like they're along the sides of the skin. So like the blades will get air added into them, and like that increases its efficiency in the center, but the center is also gaining efficiency from the majority of the air coming in from the top for itself, but then the sides are also gaining their efficiencies by sharing respectively. See, the rear then opens up, and that's what allows for the front to drop down or really kind of pop up as well, for the, again, it's like it's all balancing where you have equal and opposite reactions if you're going to do something. So this will rapidly pop up stupidly fast. Okay, like you can be traveling incredibly fast in the direction it's supposed to travel, and then you can hit the switch, and should you really need to, you can do this where you will immediately have this pop up and by immediately I mean within a few thousandths to tenths, depending on the speed of travel. And really use those seats that you're attached to for your jets, because this is a jet, it's a prop jet engine thingy. You know what I mean? It's a hybrid of several stuff, but that's going to immediately now be a vertical. Okay. So, which usually means it's suddenly no longer getting the smooth, like lifting characteristic of the wing that it kind of basically is. Instead, it's now going to slow down quite drastically. And it's not going to rip anything off, provided you're not going to exceed certain limits. Let's put it that way. Like, this is like an emergency kind of thing. You're supposed to transition, nicely. That kind of stuff. Like, hey, so we're just going to like go up and then we're going to start traveling forward with the lifting body, and then the intake kind of thing. We kind of tilt forward, and then we'll sort of, start having the change as it kind of shrinks in the rear, and then that gets brought up, and then, like this will then start its process of being able to effectively transition from the intake towards the front towards the rear, almost kind of like just horizontal, flat kind of thing. And it'll do it really rather fast. It's storing a lot of hydraulic fluid pressure and mass inertial energy during its rotation and use of the fuel that you are doing, along with that vortex. Okay, so that vortex now suddenly is a ginormous, huge benefit. It can like literally just stuff closed. The moment you give it the go ahead, it will suck it together, and that will pop it forward, and it's still rotating. Okay, and then like that, because it's in a ball joint kind of thing, will then connect and have that big old prop area all connect together. Now, you can do that in a fairly fast manner, like in a few seconds to it's longer, maybe a 10-second kind of thing, or you can do it where you need to do emergency kind of stuff, where you can do the thousands or uh, tenths of a second. Typically, a few seconds is good enough for most people, though. You know what I mean? So, but the intake is its own kind of craziness in terms of like those domes and all that. And it's like, how do I freaking imagine that? And it's like, the intake on the rear is opening up, and that's going to add and feed into kind of like these turbines that they use for hydroelectric dams. So it's going to be like adding itself into this intake area, but then also that intake area is also getting helped with this vortex, and so that is all a bunch of good vortexing that's creating very tightly packed in vortexes that are increasing the flow rate, but also effect of the blades in the rear and the blades in the front are extremely, relatively less vortexed, more or less, as I have a greater degree of surface area to work with than the rear. And so the rear, I can really create greater degrees of vortexes. And that will give me that efficiency back, along with more air pumped in that area, creating kind of like its own kind of sort of compressor for it, whereas the intake in the direction of travel front is basically just larger. It has more air to give it in more surface contact area effect, and I don't need as tightly managed and controlled fluid dynamics to make it work and run like that. In the middle is, of course, more or less, I shouldn't say more or less, so many dang times, extraordinarily, profoundly happy. It is, let's put it this way, it has a large amount of air going to it and a shit ton of extra compression that normally it would never really probably have, although like it still kind of does with the forward direction of travel. It's really more of like the whole thing, like all of it's balanced, and all of it's pretty much equal. The reason why I say it's like it's really, really happy where it's at is because it's the main driving factor for the stator and vortex stuff at the exhaust level, where the other outside area is more or less just curving that towards that. So like that's a really fast flow, and it can already be just fine. You know what I mean? Like it's basically just going to be used to sort of be properly diffused into the vortex, kind of thing, and have a laminar style-esque. It's not really laminar. That's the reason why I never use that word, because it's not all traveling one direction. Which is kind of it's very good, it's very close, but it's not that. You know what I mean? It's good, it's close, but it's not that. It's a near. You know what I mean? It's like good enough for me. Exactly. That's really what it turns into for me, my purposes. Because the sides of the shroud bell end kind of thing cannot extend that far. And so that's where some individuals that are, knowledgeable will say, if they ever listen to any of this, might understand where I come from, where it's like, this is cool, and it's a much better effect, and it's a far more correctly done, let's say, because like you have your pilots and passengers, like any normal helicopter amount, for where you can have up to 4 or 6 in the rear and the 2 for the pilot and co-pilot respectively. You do have a genuine, the whole thing kind of lifts around you. Like you have your room, and that's your room. That's it. Everything else moves around it. You're gonna see some stuff not do anything. Like I basically seal you in this fucker, and like I have like a bunch of padding, insulated, and if anything happened to break, stuff that's going to catch that. You know what I mean? Like plates and Kevlar kind of stuff, that kind of thing. And that's all just to be safe. I don't want to be not safe. So, right. But that means it's a static fixed, and that's where it's like, that's why you also see your seats being structural support members to that box, and the various arms and sticking ribs, stick stuff, you know, connectors that are attached to the walls, and you kind of feel like you're supposed to be almost in the gas tank in a lot of ways. You know what I mean? It's like, that you still feels fairly open, but it's obvious you have this place, and it's it. You have this place. That's it. And you go in, and that's where you sit, and there's this. Still pretty nice. Not even gonna lie. Like, you hang things, you can decorate. There's, window views if you once it, you get traveling. Usually the vertical isn't something you typically want to see. It gets covered anyways by like the air intake vortex stuff. So. But then you end up having the if you want the window, then it's like you get to see that, which is cool, but you're not going to see anything other than like if there's some good humidity in the air, you'll see the change because it's such a high flow rate and so compressed, and it's going past Mach, and so you'll see like cool shockwave, strands essentially that do that, but otherwise it's like you've got like a TV, talk to a person in front of you, they can rotate around, that kind of thing, but like there's no getting up, to like travel and walk around into some nice lounge or any of that. It's a helicopter, you know what I mean? Yeah. Yeah, no, and then there's the center area. Yeah, that's another part of that design characteristic that's there for it to do its effects. But yeah, no, you're not gonna like talk to your passengers over on that side much until yeah, room kind of changes back. So you're in a tube. I should let you know, you're basically in a tube that kind of changes a little bit around you, above and below, but it's really not much. Like, you wouldn't really think of that as a big deal. It's wider on these sides, smaller. Not much of a difference. No. But it kind of seals it off. I mean, you can talk, they can hear. You're gonna have to walk around a long way for the rear and the front. It's mostly just the front. There's only one area where you can go over to that side at the front if it's a vertical area. Horizontal means it's flying using that lift from the thing basically being a big old wing. Then that turns into its own, like, oh yeah, no, I can kind of reach over if I need to slide through. I could try and slide through, that kind of stuff. Right, because there's still things there. I have to get into it in a second. I was talking about how the whole thing there's an engine there. You know what I mean? There's obviously an engine there, right? So it's like there's an engine in the center part, but it's a relatively smaller kind of engine. Slightly, it feeds the other two that are in the rear. Remember, I was talking about that on the bike ride in. It's like I was saying, the front, then that also feeds, and okay, so then goes to those two rear parts, and so like that makes it more efficient for those two rears as well, but also means that middle also gets a little, and the front's fine, but it's going to cross in side of that tube. Yeah, well, yes, no, kind of, you're not going to be needing to be worried about that. It's not like it'll like go into the cabin, put it that way, but you are fairly close to those blades that are at the front for the props. Okay, so like you are correct, but like there's a reason why that tube exists there, and that's the only real kind of area that you have to kind of worry about. hmm Now that okay, so right, so I want to get into the bell end area, exhaust area. This exhaust area is extremely, and I mean extremely important. So many extremes. Yes, well, it needs to be. Unfortunately, I'm not getting for my wants and desires of hyperfixated, designs that I create as I go along, or in the background, like while I'm doing regular things, to just sort of brute force, and this is what I'm concentrating on, kind of stuff. Um, we need to focus on that those stators. I mean, solid pieces really have their own version of so they have to mix with the oncoming prop area and then the exhaust area, and so like there's a whole thing that goes on. And then there's the wicking and fuel pressure stuff. Right, there's a whole bunch in these things, and while there are great materials that are pretty decent at that, I need to capture some of that into actual really super high pressure areas. Okay, that are going to basically force fully be turned into a singular effect of very, very high pressure flame that is rather slow moving, and then a very fairly slow moving flame that is all also kind of trying to move the same direction, that is very rather low pressure, meaning low density, but higher heat. Yeah, no, lower density because it uses its travel of change for that vortex to push into this, a compression of the exhaust mix gas combo. I know. You have to follow with me. I get it. It gets complicated stuff sometimes. I mean, we're dealing with fluid stuff, so it's like when I do it the right way, I get a very significant increase of capture of its energy, because I'm creating what is essentially a stagnation of extremely high pressure gases that are exhausting into this sort of mostly all going the same direction, that then rapidly accelerates it once it wicks it out, because it's like this is lower pressure, this is higher pressure, ooh, and then like that then creates a version of a oscillating pressure wave up into this other area that was now traveling faster, that then goes and pushes it in back into the heavier uh, pressured, because it's denser, exhaust gases that hangs around. So it sort of like keeps a lot of the pressure where it's at. Yes. Caveat. There's always something that you must lose whenever doing something like this. So this one is safety to a degree. I have built up a degree of pressure that is like a bomb almost, that's just kind of hung where it is. And it slowly leaves in a very, very, very happy flow rate kind of travel. Like it basically balances itself out as it kind of circulates this pressure wave through this stupid vortexy thing. And then the good way to put that is it's a exhaust gas torque converter. It uses the fluid pressure wave as an increase of pressure, which then creates a version of a valve, which then creates a version, when correctly done with the spinning blades and the combo of the mixing of the vortexes and the irregular air with some fuel and then the exhaust gases, and the higher heat, then creates, basically a feedback loop of keeping the very high pressures where they are and very low pressures sort of like where that final part is. And that's another reason why it tends to be like this really weird, I kind of, but I never really do, created a atmospheric bell end, quotation marks, kind of. It's literally like atmospheric, quotation mark, and kind of, quotation mark. Like technicalities and caveats. Remember I was talking about earlier where it's like there's a whole bunch of this, stuff that means I have to make a lot of considerations and compromises. So like the compromise for not having a bell end that will properly give me an atmospheric design is that I am technically creating a extremely high pressure while the heat is not necessarily as bad as you would expect because it's always getting this mixture of fresh air, but very, very high pressure, very, very high squeeze, compressed exhaust gases that are exploding, I suppose, out in a extremely directed, together, but not all fully. I can't do all fully because that rotation will be added in. That pressure wave will still, it's because it's a 360 sphere. It doesn't just only travel one way. So it's like some of that's going to bleed off. But that bleed off then also, because you have the stators, helps basically kind of create a version of like that rebound, kind of like a two-stroke engine, where it reflects off of and then oscillated resonant frequency, which is why it helps it be so efficient once it gets up to speed. And it has to build itself up to that. Once it's at that RPM though, then it does it. But like that secondary thing, then it's also another reason why it can tend to hang around and it acts like atmospheric. Because if you didn't know, because the intake is coming in from one area or another, and that's kind of like how we can not only just tilt ourselves, but also we can just stay horizontal and just fly like a helicopter, but more, if I'm being honest, a very terrifying, screaming UFO that's gonna probably murder anything below it. Because it's a big old ginormous blowtorch. But you're safe inside, no worries on that. Like, to be fair and really frank about it, the reason why I'm like, I don't use that much fuel is because that exhaust is being kept around and I'm only maintaining that exhaust heat and pressure there, and the resultive Venturi flow is what allows for the lifting body characteristics from all angles, and then I can change the shape of how much it intakes one area versus another, giving me a lessened degree of intake, and then therefore I can move one area or another, you know what I mean, to varying degrees of speed. Then it's really, you need to try and tilt it, you know what I mean, which usually is the center / outsides, which are going to be angled. If you don't know, it's an angling. So like that creates its own version of a pitch and yaw tail. like it's got like the move this way, that way for for your yaw, and then like pitch as well for the up and down. So like the whole thing kind of like helps itself pitch up and down and yaw effectively. And so two do the bell end nozzle area and stator areas because they will shift to produce higher pressures here versus lower pressures there to try and tilt it. Or if you want to rapidly ascend an incredible amount of pressure towards the center, that then will explosively expand more or less outwards into the extremely high flow rate jets of the outside parts where the bell end is, trying to use a detonation velocity level of expansional property pressure wave to push onto the bell end. That creates a shock wave towards the center and a resonance frequency that then pushes it back up towards the center again, creating another version of a rotational vortex, I suppose, inside of the exhaust gases that are being used there and expanding and flowing to kind of try and push that pressure wave. It's really just pressure waves. Again, it's not like it's going to make that exhaust gas do this crazy. It's still going to look like a jet engine's or rocket engine's exhaust, where it's just like a spike, more or less. But it's doing these things inside of it that gain it some efficiency back. Again, it's small amounts. There's all compromises all up in this design. You know what I mean? If I could just get like a larger bell end, do a similar version with like a little thing in the inside, it'd be so much better. Because then it's like, oh, I can alter and change the atmospheric, change of effect across the bell end much better, not to mention flow rates and therefore speeds that I can then capture and use as a lifting body characteristic between the Vitrulia effect around it, and then create like the bell ends actually now creating lift as well for itself, not just thrust. So, but that's another story for another day that I still haven't yet to ever complete, if I'm being honest. Because I was like, I have an intergalactic engine that just fires it that way, like near light speed. So why do I need that? To a point, right? So, but moving on, the whole body is shaped to create those whole vortexy things. The center, which normally bifurcates off to the rear, excuse me, is now going to slot and change and be used for some of those stators and basically air channeling and vortex inducing and so on. All right, now, because I'm effectively just making a really hot, dense, extremely hot, dense gas, because again, the skirt, while fairly decently long, I mean, it's nothing that you would be stating is like the big old bell ends of a rocket engine. It's still able to capture a good amount of the energy. It's what it is. But that in its own right is separate from the intake area, which now needs to have its own lifting characteristics for the panel wing kind of thing that it is. The center is basically trying to just move stuff from the outside donut or toroidal or whatever, side areas versus the vertical center and then using this vertical, the bifurcation, kind of like a wing panels, to create a version of a start of an intake inducer, vortex inducer, that starts creating that Venturi sort of effect that starts a process of dragging more air in a already started vortex, helping improve the efficiency of the design. Again, it's all about that balance and compromise, and you have to get it up and running. Once it goes, it really starts to continue this effect, kind of like creating vacuum fields to a degree. Quotation marks. Right. It's really frictional fields. Yeah, frictional coefficient, charge, magnetic, blah, blah, blah things that are this is going to start pushing more, pressure here, and then charge, and then spin, and then the fluid and the friction, and that drags more, and then you get the whole effect as it goes through. And then it increases further and further and further as you get more and more suction, and you put more and more energy into it, and improve in greater and greater degrees of this vacuum field. I like to call it, I guess, a vacuum field in a way, but it's not really, but then it kind of is. But it extends. This is what I'm trying to get across. Like this extension between the center of this area, because it still has a fan blade. That center fan blade is the same size as the middle. Wait, and I'm like, give it a second, because there is an engine in there, but then that sends off to the rear engines. That is correct, with both of them, and the center and the middle added to that rear, so that way those rears are now more efficient, like I was saying. But this time it's like, no, we can't really use that in the same way. Those are they're kind of closed off. But to a point, no, because like those are already going to cross in front, and like when you're traveling forward, these crossed in front blades kind of create a wingtip canceller, wingtip vortice canceller, that then, which we kind of got around with our whole helicopter, golden ratio kind of circle at the tip, that it tries to screw in towards the center. Well, this one, I don't really need to do that because I have a shroud. You know what I mean? So but when it's on the side, it's like, oh yeah, no, that's gonna start a process of creating, and if I angle in these little blade stators that are statically there, a continuation of a concentration of rotation effect for those blades to create a lessened loss for that vortex that's there on the blade tips, that then also adds itself to the center area for that intake design for that engine turbine prop as well. There's a center engine turbine that then will run the prop. So that you see what we're saying. There's two big ones, and then like this one is kind of technically not running unless necessary or needed, meaning it's necessary to run it. So like that's the caveat. It's like, well, technically this is an engine. It's like there's no doubt about that. That's an engine. I have an engine. Like no one can fucking say it's not an engine. You know what I mean? Like even I can't even on a technicality be like, there's no engine. No, there's engines. It's there. I have engines. But on a technicality, technically I don't, because they're not running. Instead, they're just residual energy from the 6 total engines that are running the outside props. And so I'm like, are you sure I need like 2 extra? All right, okay, sure, why not? I also have cross-feeding blades for the front. You know what I mean? So do I? No, the middles don't connect. No worries. They get you're a passenger. Remember, I'm not gonna make them that big. So, and remember the whole Bernoulli's principle, faster flow rate. But if I do it the right way, with the right fan blade shape in the vortex that's continuing along the screw part of the blade, that creates a measurable degree of continued compression with the next area that then is going to add into that uh, vortex effect through the exothermic combustion exhaust gases by, first off and foremost, injecting them into the vortex opposing more than anything else. Like instead of the vortex itself, it's on the opposing side, but it needs to mix in with the regular air. And so like that will first off push the blade for the other one to move. And so like the engine is trying to move the blades on the outside, meaning the props, countered to the blades that are in all the, like I described my engine and put it up for the turbine kind of thing. For that, style of engine, like that's kind of basically what we're doing here, which then that's going to go into the main props, but then like that exhaust has to go into like those opposing to the log vortex, because we're trying to create like a boundary layered vortex that's effectively a very thick, hard, compressed fluid that's being, moved because it's trying to get to this much, much, much less dense fluid, but it's always this thing where it's like you have to do a lot more work than that to make that work than just put it there. You know what I mean? So typically I just inject it into the in-between area where the vacuum was, because typically that vacuum starts a process of that flow. That vortex flow creates these really, really good channels of flow that's in the center of the props. But then that center channel flow is going to be disrupted with the next blade that's going to capture that and then create another vortex. Okay. And so that exhaust is going to be kind of added into the boundary layer on the leading edge on the opposite side, but then that flow that's in the inside of that is then going to be heated up and further accelerated and then mixed, because of course it's not perfect, but again, we're not actually looking for it not mix. We want it to mix. We want it to cool off those exhausts, but that exhaust profile, the way it comes out, creates a measurable degree of thrust, which will then help spin those blades as well. But then it also pushes on the blades, helping spin those blades the same direction that they need to travel in. Now, it's all about like that log vortex, and then like, which is going to boundary layerly basically just stay together with this twisted, spinny blade thing, but I also have to have that vortex or the wingtip vortex canceled once it's in the shroud, because it's in a groove. And that's why it's like, it's a very kind of almost like a horn, but then it's not really a horn. It's definitely a prop, but then it's in a blade, but then it's like kind of a different type of thing because we're using kind of a Scoopy swirl, but then it's like that Scoopy swirl isn't really going to be the right kind of play. And so to describe like a blade like that is kind of difficult, you know, and we have to induce a vortex at the separation of the central axle where the turbine compressor, all that is going to be spinning that outer blade, and then the exhaust is going to also add itself into the blade area as well. And so that separation starts a vortex, you know, from the outside fan shroud, and then the intake area, kind of like bumpy, you know, separator axle part. I know, right? It's like, oh, it's a few different things, but if you do it the right way, it like creates the vortex, and then that vortex will extend, you know, keep creating that vortex as it continues down the line of the blade, and it'll go into the next blade, and then it'll go into the next blade, and it'll go into the next blade, as it adds in further and further degree from that continuation of centripetal and centrifugal rotational effects and inertial effects and flow rate effects. Then it crashes into, with the separation now no longer occurring between the two different blade parts, meaning the part that's creating the pressure differentials that creates the spin, it makes the blade spin, then creates the it connects, like it's going to wick off like the two vortexes, and are then, okay, so the vortex at the top, the wingtip is in a groove that's then going to go into this stator that's in the shroud, that then creates a opposite, you know, counter rotational effect. And so like as it trails off, it creates this, as the underside vortex then skips into this combination of, and mixes and bifurcates basically with the rotation vortex and cancellational style of vortex. So it's like you have one vortex, let's say it's counterclockwise. The other one that's traveling as the vortex, it's then now, let's say, clockwise again, or, you know, clockwise that is. But then the stator is going to try and make it clockwise. And this stator is going to add to that vortex. That vortex is fine with going with that standard, already traveling that direction vortex. But then this one is like, no, I'm now doing that. And it's like, yep. And then it mixes during that moment, producing a greater degree of expansion, but also compression, because remember, that's a compressed fluid as it's spinning and adding that spin as it rotates backwards, and continuing to compress and flow and all that stuff. And so as a result, when you do it right, it then will wick together and sort of mix sort of thing. It's two different fluids, right? But they're Newtonian. They're compressible. Even the exhaust. And so the exhaust will essentially be slowed down, whereas but then it also imparts that energy into the vortex that's provided by the blade, and that blade then is now, or that vortex is now gained extra pressure, and as a result, extra speed and extra effect of the vortex. And so the next air intake that's coming through that vortex, because it still isn't perfect, it still comes in, it still has more air to come in with it, okay, and then it's further continuing its separation of the two, and then it's hotter again with the next exhaust. This is mixing with the regular air. Okay, so the regular air is just getting mixed with the exhaust. All right, and now it's being separated in such a way where it has a resistance to traveling towards the front air intake. Then it's using that energy of that vortex to provide a greater degree of separation of this pressure differential and mixture, because it's like, oh, I'm still going to continue my vortex, but now the vortex has extra heat. But that extra heat and the result of increased flow, the directionality of that flow, also provides a decrease, all of that really does, of pressure. But then, like, the very outer edges are very fairly held together and quite dense still. And then the other side of it is, of course, much just higher flow rate. And so much less dense by comparison, and therefore less pressured. But still mixed with air. Okay, and so then it does that again as it shrinks, and it has exhaust added in, and pressing on it by adding more pressure there, and still less pressure here again, but still more flow rate. Then you get a degree of continued flow rate, and as a result, more spin speed for the middle fan blade. Okay, but then it's also going to compress. Yes, it's taking a smaller to a larger to a smaller size, and then really compacting that size as well as it's doing this into an even smaller size. Okay, right. And then the third one is literally basically just a version of like, hey, so what if we added, just for shits and giggles here, just for some shits and giggles, you know what I mean? Yeah, nothing too fancy, just like some fuel. Why would we do that? Why don't we just add some fuel? You know what I mean? And so that exhaust effectively gets compressed, spun and sped up, then is then hitting this leading edge of these blades. Then that's also compressing it, but that's also where like it can now, with the extra fuel and the extra heat, and of course we can add in fuel. That is, we can also put in what's a good way to put this? These wicking effects, wicking channel effects. So like Venturi is a wonderful person on this one, because it's like that's literally how carburetors work. So it's like this highly compressed, highly sped up air is now going to have this blade that is shaped, instead of for a maximal vortex, for wanting maximal wicking speed and flow effect, and combinational effect towards from the outside towards the center, and so it drags towards that center, but also is bifurcating that blade, just like any other centripetal compressor will do. Goes up against the housing. That's correct. And then the housing, of course, has its own stator blades that are going to work together with this, creating these momentary areas of increased flow as it goes through, and that creates a suctioning and added airflow, and then the next as it opens up, produces a high flow rate with this stagnated but now air or fuel rich, because most of it burnt and then and fired off, but then some of it sticks around with some still fairly fuel rich exhaust gases, and then air comes in, and then that allows for that burn to happen, and then that pressure wave comes up, but then that fuel rate, and then fuel gets burnt. As the pressure wave goes forward, it produces again another push towards the blades, effectively the air coming in. And so it's a good way to put this. So as those blades from the middle are going to come into the final last one, and again it's like, okay, so there's this center. What's the center doing? Which is like it's getting compressor air because those are, you know, props. Sure, great, right, but like it's still spinning fluid. You know what I mean? And that's happening. Yeah, the hydraulic fluid. Okay, and fuel as a pump. So like that then just pushes that around like any other turboprop from a hydraulic fluid, pump essentially. Those are pumps that are running that as a, I guess, supercharger. But then so are the blades that are the props that are going to come in between at the front that are going to help improve efficiency for the intake of that intake area and further allow for a better flow characteristic and separation and vortexing flow rate and vacuuming flow rate as a result of both of those designs. And so as it comes in, it's constantly compressing. And so for the most part, it'll do just fine, like as a basically regular ram air supercharger, turbocharger, more or less. But then you can add in some fuel and it will also spin and then add that exhaust into the final other two blade and intake area combo things. So let's get into those areas because it's like that's bifurcated, and so it's going to add in a measurable degree of increase of pressure that's resisting, but it's all about those blade angle shapes and these stator blade angle shapes as they will pass through, creating moments of like squeeze that pushes it with a little bit of fuel now there, that then it's opened in a much greater area, which then expands. Okay, and let's put it this way, so that it hangs around, it then detonates basically where that is, because it's a fairly high heat and fairly high pressure, and then here's some more air for you. How do you do, and then you get your expansion. Now, that expansion, of course, is now going to expand into where the blades are, pushing the blades, then squeezing into other little areas. It pushes into those little wicking effect zones, but then you have a fuel pressure system rail kind of thing, hollow, whatever. But that is, just really kind of designed and meant to kind of hold it there. I know. So give me a second. This is a lot of work to describe. I wish I could use my hands to show you what I'm doing. Should have started recording with my computer video. Yeah, I'm just recording with voice. So anyways, this is going to speed up its flow. And so that flow, even though it's like quite hot and pressured, will suck in a little bit of fuel. Then it will get a degree of, oh, hey, I have a place for myself to expand into. And this is now, because the fuel is there, less pressured, because fuel will eat and vaporize, eat the heat, that is, and then vaporize. And then it will go and add in this higher pressure, comparatively, fluid that has more air in it. And then it detonates and expands. And then like that pressure pushes up one direction and it's going to expand in the rear direction, towards the intake. But then that also will expand towards the other rear, meaning direction opposite to your forward travel. That will then spin the blades as well faster, producing greater and greater degrees of spin. Okay, but yeah, I know, right? We have to create a hang during the squeeze, and so that hang is actually a vortex. And so like that vortex is then going to be more or less a very low pressure zone in one area, and then this blade is right there to effectively capture and sort of disrupt and turbulent it and cause it to kind of stick around to a degree. And then air that's trying to come in, which would be around that other outside as it hung around, then pulls in towards that, as it already had that effect previously. You have to remember about that. Then it comes in, it expands, and then then you see where it's more, instead of a up and down, it's more of a constant flow towards the direction opposite to your travel, but also that pressure actually does travel up towards pushing towards those fan blades to push further in and spin faster. But we're also going to be doing a little bit more than you might expect, where that flow then creates a mass airflow, just like valves, when you hear them with their intake manifold, and they shape it a very particular way to increase pressures and at certain RPMs to gain an advantage to horsepower and torque. Well, similar thing with the exhaust. We're basically going to do a very similar profile, but it's a countered sort of thing. So it's like here and then 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 here, and it's over here and over there and over there and over here and over there, and that kind of thing. So it's like it's at the initial point, and then it's over towards the rear where that pressure wave oscillates, and then it's over on, let's say, the 12-6 McDog is trying to destroy something. So the 12 and 6 and 9 and 3, and then it's the opposite to that. And so it basically rotates around this intake movement and continued combustion process that continues to keep the prop spinning, and which are already getting added to with the exhaust and air intake respectively, both from your front part of the engine that traveled all the way back down here, and also the middle part as well, and then the exhaust gases. And so it's a lot of actual very fast, very compressed, very high flow rate air and fuel now coming together. At that point, we now have extremely high speed flow rates that are, again, this vacuum, the blade that's traveling from the front and all that, connects all the way to the rear. And it's traveling around that, also at, oscillating resonant frequency fluid pressure wave. But that is creating these moments of I'm switching where my string is diffusedly spread out across the entirety of this design, but it's then connected all the way to the front. And so that then hyper flow rates I know, and I mean hyper. When I mean that, I mean hyper, because it's going all the way to the very rear part where it finally really does exhaust. It collapses this vortex into, instead of spinning, it then gives up spin for direction and nality only travel, which then we have the bell end kind of style, sort of it interacts with, because it's extremely highly pressured. So we need a fairly long kind of and big, bell end. But that's also another reason why I have two of them that are directing it towards a central or more centrally located area. Instead of exactly directly out, it's more of we're going to take a little bit of a cheaty move to extend the entirety of this whole exhaust pressure to the entire rear area, which is a huge bell end now, with a couple of these aerospike design changes. Okay, so the connecting parts to this kind of wide sort of aerospike-esque thing is really just their to help redirect and diffuse the exhaust in a pressurized, practically exhaust manifold almost, but it's flowing extremely high speed. But that also allows for it to interact on two different fronts for the aerospike as a bell end in its own right, but then the it also allows for this decrease of boundary layer and change of the vortex to being a directed flow, only one real direction kind of thing, but quotation marks on that one because it's like it still has a little bit. You know what I mean? We still have a little bit there. Yeah, I'll get to it, but like that, those little bit of boundary layer effects and canceling out a vortex as it diffuses towards the center, and that's kind of how it does that and comes out as a pressurized system, like with the aerospike standard kind of thing. And then we are able to move that in and out a little bit. It helps us capture the majority of that thrust. So it will, if you know about cars, pull at high altitudes like it never really should. I mean never really should because it's a ginormous, huge wing practically. It has like these things that'll taper off kind of to these points, but they're kind of slightly curved in and have like these little angles and bumps, more or less to remove and delay, and then add this shock wave that's there from the leading edge and everything, that because we still got those bumps and everything else, but can't always use that. So, you know what I mean? Like it's more efficient, but this boundary layer needs to be properly utilized. And so we have these little channels. Remember, we had those little fins that were on those plates before. Well, now they're sealed, but now those fins are still there. And so those fins create like this very specific channeling of a boundary layer into wings towards the rear where the thrust is. Creating that lift. Remember that whole bell end lift that I was talking about? Well, it's a Bernoulli or Venturi effect lift. So like it's creating a Venturi effect that's also creating a very specific pocket of a very slightly slower, but specifically made to increase flow rates and lifting characteristics from the bottom versus the top. For the wing that it is, while having a movable thrust vectoring kind of thing that then has like that outside lifting area become its own version of a circular tail piece that allows for direction of pitch and yaw respectively, along with your standard ailerons and all that stuff being added to that big old kind of wing thing there too, that is going to use that boundary layer to its greatest advantage. And then you still have, it's still a ginormous wing body thing, so that then still allows for a huge amount of efficiency, kind of like a big old whale, if I'm being honest, like stingray whale almost. If I'm being candid, it's kind of a little bit like a stingray whale that sort of starts to look a little bit when it changes into a octopus jellyfish thingy, sort of a thing. Anyways, but it will pull at extremely high altitudes to the point where you need a proper, probably spacesuit. You know what I mean? Because you could feasibly, if you had the right amount of fuel and all the rest of it, with oxidizers, could get out of our atmosphere. But again, that's more fuel and more trouble than it's usually worth. So, like you can do it, but it's not really sort of meant for that. I just make things that are supposed to adapt for all ranges that it can. And it does this very, very effectively and efficiently, but
its best use is genuinely as sort of a helicopter, low, altitude to somewhat high altitude lifting body characteristic plane slash uh, hovering craft. So, like it can hover and it can stay there, but you aren't really supposed to hover anywhere near, you know, uh, the ground unless you have it, you have it built to handle the heats that it's going to put out. Because it's like a rocket at that point, but it's like and some people want that, but for me it was like, oh, that's like hyper high spec design. Like you need to get all the way up into, super high altitude and like maybe even space, right? But then for me, it turned into, okay, I can tone the shit out of this back really hard. I can add a slightly different direction when it comes down to like where the exhaust comes out, and then um, create a better version of this lifting body characteristic with lighter materials. And I don't need to have it be going into space or anything. And so now it, while has some exhaust gases, it's just a hotter air. It's the same as like any other you, you know helicopter. So, which would be just fine. So I figured that would be an easier way to get it to work instead of uh, let's put it this way, instead of using this design the way you might expect, like with like a fuselage kind of like all lifting wing thing was like super, super. Uh, I was like, what am I doing? I'm trying to get around town. You know what I mean? I'm trying to make this like a personal thing. You don't need to worry stuff, that kind of stuff. So that turned into, oh, I'll just have a wing extender in the front, like extend the wings, and I'll put like basically a Osprey version design or four corner style wings that are now there that will lift along with a body that's kind of more designed to also help with lift, for small amounts of passengers in the direction of travel it's going to travel in, because that's kind of what we're looking for. And then gimbaling is a basic kind of thing on that side, because instead of having the wing move, it's more of the engine move. And so then it's like, oh, well, how do I go around making the engine, move, which turns into um, uh, these. It's a good way to put that, because I have these really compact turbine engines with the props, and then like I only need technically two blades, but then I can always add like a third, in the middle to try and make this whole effect occur, and try and produce a greater degree of efficiency for its effect. Add a little bit of fuel in the middle, and then let it do its compression ignition in the rear final part. A little bit of bell end nozzle movement. Basically get what it is I need from those engines, from the four corners. Um, it's the shoulder area, which is fine. And then instead of what you might expect, I do the NASA, where it's going to have the strut basically to the center of the fuselage, where it's kind of like a curved kind of wing area, to allow for that with those ridges and bumps towards the front, and fuselage intake that's going to go and basically bifurcate, and then use those two ones at the side. Give me a second. And then those kind of trailing off wing areas from the struts and so on in the front, we'll essentially have it stick a little closer to the fuselage, which now means I have that as a scoop slash, increase of lift, and then the exhaust can also be used to sort of be slightly directed towards alongside of this scooping kind of area, directed flow from the strut into the rear side engines. I get to it for the movement, right? This is hold your horses. But that allows for a greater degree of efficiency of intake, as the Venturi systems tend to help themselves out here with the boundary layer. Tends to stick around with those little, fullers and channels, and then dimples and bumps that also help redirect, and then the exhaust can be slightly added into that, effect for the front, and so because I don't really need as much as you might expect, because if I can get a little bit of that heat, then I don't need spark ignition, and then that exhaust, which has still quite a good degree of heat and still a good amount of air, I can still add that into the system to allow for a better forward path flight efficiency of combustion and thrust characteristics. Now, when it's going vertical, and I get the gimbaling. See, the gimbaling is kind of rough right now. Gimbaling is a catch-all for me. I don't like the kind of way that people. I have two different struts here, basically connecting points to this thing, but I need it to be able to do a ball joint, but I don't really need a ball joint. I only really need a hemisphere. I don't need that much travel. So, that's kind of what that is. And so that's its own version of like a separator piece, slider piece sort of thing, where it's like a kind of like a cone that's kind of like a sort of sphere, it's got like a kind of mostly a hemisphere, it's round sphere, but then it like spreads off like it's hourglass, I guess, that then has T parts, perpendicular parts, that is, to that cone that's coming off of that sphere. Okay, that allows for the fuel intake and air intake, respectively, to go in to the sides. And as that continues to push forward, that'll gain a greater degree of measurable advantages. Now, it bifurcates because it's like it's technically quadricating, but it is a fairly decent, front-facing area. Like, you can be on the outer sides of that, teardrop, but the majority of it's the fuselage, which is fine, but then like that outside fuselage, is pretty much just, the inside is fine being empty. You know what I mean? We want passengers. We need it to slow down and, taper to a point, that kind of thing. But then we want to add this, diagonal strutting and sort of like curving into these areas where the engines are. And so I need that area to be another intake while it's standing still. Okay, and what that means for us is that it adds a measurable impact in terms of efficiency for our forward directional travel, but when we are sitting still, it still adds what is plenum volume towards the middle, and as it accelerates into the then compression ignition rear part of the engine. And so it adds like a measurable degree of air mass flow that's very good at keeping and maintaining the engine's performance at slow speeds while just trying to hover. Okay, but it can go around and through several parts of the area for the fuselage from that air intake that is now going to be used to separate much more efficiently around from that center in and then into the engines, which is basically a version of like ram kind of air, you know, more or less. So now that also means it's hollow, but the outside of that, because that's where that air is going to come in through, that's where the separator of that little ball and cone and perpendicular T area is. That's a seal, okay, that allows for gimbaling. Okay, and that means that I can now add in fluid that acts as a reservoir and lubricant that allows for pressurization into multiple areas of any bladder system on those T-joint areas, while also lubricating that other joint area where the air is flowing through, which means I get a pretty good amount of movement from that. But I want it to be faster, and so if you add in a few gears and a few bearings, you can now quickly rotate it forward, and then you can rotate it back, and you can shift it up and down and diagonally, basically on that sphere area. And so all of that is one piece that we then also use hydraulic ram on the outside struts, basically, that are redundancies. Like this part does most of that work. But just in case that ever failed, this will also be able to do the work. And those also help that part not fail as much, because, redundancy too on that side. They ever fail, we got this. Both of them fail. Yeah, I don't know what to do for you. Sorry. Try and glide. Think light thoughts. Really? No, if I'm going to be really stupid and obtuse about it, I have a bunch of parachutes and a hot air balloon design thing, because I have a bunch of ability to make a bunch of hot gases. So I'm like, there's nothing saying I can't just like dump that a little into, a hot air balloon kind of like parachute thing that's going to help you glide just a little more safely to the ground and not be a plummeting doom kind of scenario. But again, really kind of certain altitudes, and yes, while it's very, very fast at trying to do its job, it's still a regular maintenance, keep up to date, repair, all that stuff sort of thing. So, but otherwise, it's that's, and then the wings in the front expand. They just horizontally expand and then slot into place. That's basically what that is. And we'll explain, dunk, and then those dunk and dunk and dunk. Basically that. So it's like it goes outwards, the top part moves out, and then it shrinks inwards, and then it shrinks, as in like from out towards the center, and then from the further away distance horizontally, it then will come in horizontally towards the fuselage, slotting and sticking it in, making it more rigid in the process, and more sealed and less air resistance drag stuff, which is all good news. which it's like you have like two strut thingies here, and I'm like, yeah, well, that's for the front. It's just the front. I don't like to do anything on the rear, so like the front will slowly expand, and like that is just a hinge. If you don't know, for the bottom, so like the front top is going to expand and do that little thing that gives the bottoms the ability to hinge and slowly open, and then like this then has the ability to move forward and gimbal respectively, and then you still have the vectoring, the exhaust vectoring for your thrust. And now you have lift from basically a biplane with 4 biplane things, then lifting body characteristic because you have the center intake, remember? Right, which is going into your engines. Well, that produces with the right lip design, kind of like in the front, like a chin sort of thing, makes a lifting body characteristic when you angle it correctly, even though it's kind of a teardrop, but it doesn't exhaust out. It goes into well, it does. But it goes into the engines. So as a result, it creates a version of a lifting body characteristic as it flies through and ram airs for you. So like you have a higher pressure and a lower pressure in that boundary layer, and then like much faster flow. So then you can just sort of be able to use the entirety of it to move forward much more efficiently. And then when it's not and it's just hovering, it's fairly efficient. It is just the engines more or less doing the work instead of like that other one, which was like the body does all these cool things. I ditched it. I ditched it more or less for a very highly efficient turbo kind of thing setup where it's a quadcopter that's sort of better designed for its use for like little tiny bus trips, I suppose. You know what I mean? Then a smaller version for like a passenger or two is much, much easier, where you really only need about little 2 kind of, but then like 2 is kind of the hard part and hard sell when it comes down to that. To explain it a little easier, 2, the reason why like a lot of us that think about this stuff, 2 is so much easier because it's like those are larger fan blade and so therefore more efficient. But then you're balancing instead of 4 points and with the center egg in this, and so the easier to kind of dangle it around. Now you're balancing it on just like a single stick, and it's like kind of hope it doesn't twist or turn the wrong way. And that's kind of what, but you have gimbaling, and so you can do it. But it's a little bit more complicated as a result, and I just don't like it as much. 4 will do just fine. And then let's see here, because I can have 4 passengers in there, and I have the ability to, for that air intake on the inside, instead of like forward, because it's mostly just short range travel. No longer are we going to take that larger air intake for like a bus size. And instead, we're going to be using what is that turboprop thing that I talked about, where that hydraulic fluid gets used to spin stuff, right? Like that's going to go in towards the center. Now the center has its own version of a fan blade that's going to take some of the energy from the turbines and the exhaust from those turbines on the 4 areas, and use that hydraulic fluid pressure to more or less just spin fans in the center of this kind of egg kind of shape. And that sort of, it's more of it's more of the same kind of teardrop, more than anything else, but it takes air in from the top because it separates as a cross pattern, meaning in 4 places, and little triangles will connect over top and then stay there and seal it. Then they'll open, allow air to come in, and then of course it gets accelerated, and then gives us a degree of thrust, which is what we're looking for. And so that center now becomes a supportive, instead of dangling, it helps support itself as well. And then the 4 then just more or less help move it and angle that center, which is just going to add to it, whatever it does. So it's a little bit more efficient for the use of the energy you're using to help support the more hovering characteristic for short travel, for maybe 5-passenger kind of tiny car or subcompact, with kind of like design. So like that's what that design is. It's got the 4, it's got the fairly large, but then you're kind of like in this area, you're in a basically car, cabin that has, like, instead of a center console now, you've got this tube is in the center, that kind of thing. Which I know some people probably might not like that, but for me, it's like that's a crash support structure that, if you've ever seen domes, like, they have that circle in the center, what I mean? So that way it spreads its pressure, all of it's pressing into this one area around the entirety of that circle, and uses the material to support itself a lot better, so it doesn't collapse in. Kind of a similar philosophy for this. It's like I can make a lot lighter materials, a lot thinner. I don't need metamaterials. I don't need to do anything special or spectacular. So I can just use regular aluminum or something like this. And then I have the ability to have those wing extend, and same thing with the rear, push forward, and then that also allows for a little bit of thrust from that center, but then that fully supports if it ever happens to need to land, but then I also manage, because of the struts and so on. Basically, it's a whole bunch of stuff that supports itself with a bunch of rigidity and, internal ribbing and external support kind of thing. So it's like it's got internal and then external, and then it's using the material to support itself along the surface area, and the material design strength, tensile strength is where we're at in terms of what you can feasibly do on regular manufacturing lines. So pretty good for what it is. And you're not going to go further than like 400, maybe 1,000 miles. The bus, it's like, okay, the bus gives you like a solid 1,000, maybe 2,500 miles. And then bigger than that, like, you get the picture for the more fuel use and more time, blah 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 blah. So 2,500 miles is the reason why I'm like, that's a pretty decent little thing, right? Because to me, it's scalability for cargo. Like, kind of. We've all heard about the Amazon thing, where they have a blimp and then they kind of send it off from the blimp to everywhere else. Well, I kind of expanded upon that because I was like, I'm kind of bored. I have nothing to do, so I figured, and it seemed like it was really cool, so I was like, oh, okay, we'll just do this. That kind of thing. So I was like, oh, if I use essentially the height characteristics of the blimp where it's at, and then use a simple amount of batteries in the design of the fuselage as structural components that are also getting cooled by, the boundary layer fin channel things. So then I have the turbine turboprop things, and I only really need to add in a little bit of hydrogen kind of stuff. So that allows for, which it can pick up based upon the solar panel that is attached to the roof at the top. That allows for collection from the humidity that's up there over time to be separated with a basic HHO generator by using ultrasonic frequencies, and then that cool new material that's like a super cool catalyst, and then some electricity and salt and so on. so that way it produces decent amounts of HHO. And so like hydrogen can then, because it's colder up there, and I've got some energy from the oxygen needing to be bled off, meaning it turns into a turbine set up to use as a compressor that helps compress and store the hydrogen, and cool it off a little. Like then we have to go with the ultrasonic, like the opposite opposing frequency versus where it's helping generate the HHO. That then turns into pushing heat out of the area where we're going to try and cool and compress the hydrogen. And so, alongside of using well, I didn't come up with it at the time, but I was like, electric motors would do. I mean, sure, they had to be a little bit strong or powerful, but, they'll do. But then I was like, right, but wind, and then heat, and then there's nothing saying I can't use my windmill with the added degree of efficiency gains from that vacuum design. And then I can gain also a measurable increase for an axial radial sort of a flux thing with the stators that are inside, and then the vacuum blade design with the charge field and electromagnetics from the axial flux, but instead of like getting the option to shrink it like I wanted to, instead it's like it's going to remain statically fixed. It's just a windmill, but it's like that allows for that electricity now to be helped with the wind that is usually up there in those altitudes to gain a measurable with the leftover remainder from the efficient solar panel design that we're going to use the now gaseous refrigerant kind of thing that helps the band gap of solar panels get kind of helped out by it creating some increase of photons and electron catalytic kind of thing. It allows for it to jump and create an electron during its field, effectively, for its orbital field, that is, from that refrigerant. Anyways, that cools it, and then that goes into the windmill, which helps dump that heat into that flow, which allows for a remainder of that vacuum area to stay, which helps continue to push that energy back into the system. And of course, you never get everything back, but some of it. And so I have more efficient solar panels. Now I have a more efficient windmill, and more often is on, and then is creating electricity. But really, we're just making it more efficient, and then we're just going to use that more efficient part because there's less parasitic loss. Because basically trying to get itself to keep going, to then add our own amounts of torque to it to help compress and utilize the hydrogen compression and cooling to make a measurable amount of, not free, but fuel, hydrogen fuel for those drones. So, right, and so that's stored into the fuselage hollow wing area. That's also then going to slowly kind of fuel regulate itself to dump into with the structure supportive, again, wing, batteries, which are now more salt than lithium. In the past I used salt, but now it's like, lithium, but now I use salt because salt's really easy, and they're about as good. Actually, they're better currently right now, from what I've continuously been told, than lithium ion. But then it's like I can also do diamond like carbon salt with a insulator, which is the ceramic / metal. So it's a metal that's coated with the insulated to insulative ceramic that then has the battery as a part of that, which the in-between is then going to be the pressurization of these sealed areas that are going to hold our fuel, that is hydrogen, that also helps support and keep the structure of the craft more rigid and able to handle those higher loads until after it has obviously dropped the load off and then goes to return to its blimp, which is pretty good. And the blimp's solar panel kind of whole thing is like, well, that's the hot area. Well, the cold area, which is the shady area, is its own version of a surface area thing that I can use. So basically, for me, I use that as the dumping of the heat from the hydrogen and all that process into the blimp, which you kind of want that heat to go into the blimp because it keeps it for the helium aloft more easily for what it's worth. But of course we still have to do more than just that, but it's just trying to use those frequencies to dump it in to the helium and the air respectively, helping the compression and cooling effect that we need for the hydrogen. The oxygen just gets dumped in to the windmills. I just don't need it. It produces more oxygen. I don't need oxygen. I don't have carbons. I don't want a carbon generator, a carbon dioxide generator. So, and I don't need it to use it. So it's just hot oxygen, well, warm more than anything, but like dumped into the windmills. So works out well enough and helps with the flow rate and densities respectively. So was a decent enough design, I felt, for what it was basically, and would be able to work pretty efficiently for a fairly long time. It still needs maintenance, still needs all the rest of the stuff, but it works out pretty darn well, right? There isn't really much of an issue except for the windmill actually produces thrust. Once it gets up to the right speed, it then tries to basically really accelerate the flow to keep itself going, maintaining a vacuum, which it can do that. It just needs the right, blade angles and all the rest of that stuff. So, it's just a thing, you know what I mean? It's like when you look at it, it's like, this seems like so much work, but it's like once you do it, it's done. But then it's like, it's really just it's a decent amount of thrust. You know what I mean? It's like, where's this blimp going? Where's the blimp going, dude? And it's like, well, so I made the blimp into a ginormous wing. So this thrust makes more lift, and so now I make easier with less helium, and now helium hotter, and so now hotter helium make more, so the balancing act of material, all that stuff went up and running with all the rest of the extra that's necessary. Right, because that's kind of what that is. But then I just sort of, here's a bunch of freaking packages, you know what I mean? Whatever someone needs, I suppose. That's basically all that is, and it will entail. It's like now you'll more or less get a version of a hive or honeycomb, this thing. So it's going to have the flowers over at the warehouse. We're just going to grab the packages and some extra hydrogen and some, electricity. It's going to then run itself up over to the blimp. The blimp will then give that some hydrogen and a little bit of electricity, dump it in, and then send it back to go get some more. And so and then that has its own storage of, bees to go send it off towards your everyday homes, which are different than flowers. So kind of in that aspect, it's not a hive. You gotta remember that. But similar kind of idea, I guess, ish. Not really, but whatever. Yeah, it's supposed to be, what it is for, which is like the blimp is now like a central hub, that's able to use hydrogen and electricity more efficiently for getting people their packages, their deliveries faster in a more efficient manner from the bigger, now quadcopter kind of thing that then sends it the 2,500 miles, and then you have the big old rail system. I designed I have to talk about that later, but it's basically a huge 5x5 Connex box that's going to use rails, those little wheels on rails, but they're also going to use these, electromagnetic, not superconducting, but electromagnetic, and then this hugely different pressure differential across 15-mile long size of this train that's going to have the tube that it sits in that then uses the intake area that's going to basically dynamically sealed off at the front and in the rear, that then uses that change in pressure to with a degree of these turbines again, but instead of turbines like we're using, more of an electrical version, more electrical prop things that create a huge lifting body characteristic, very huge lifting body characteristic. We're talking it's a ginormous, huge amount of pressure underneath, basically a vacuum above, and then a bunch of magnets here trying to push it up, and charge fields at the top that's trying to lift it up, and then a bunch of aerodynamics to make it very, very streamlined for it going through and to do this effect, and also help push it not just on the wheels, but also the thrust of the, it's now got less air in the front and more air in the rear. And so it's using pressurization, fluid flow, movement to create this benefit as well, trying to make it more efficient for what it is, which of course is the only way anyone would ever sell this to anyone. But there's a reason why it's supposed to be a in the air land mass kind of thing, where it's like a ginormous oil tanker practically. It's 15 miles long. And the reason why I wanted that is because it's if I make it as straight as I can for the right ways I can do it, and because who cares about your ideas now of this train? What is this? It's showing the size of what they used to have for these old carriages, with horses and stuff. And so that's stupid. I can simply just be in the air. Which it's wait. What are we doing? How are we going to keep it there and all the rest of it? And it's so first off, the top is a bunch of humidity dehumidifiers, it collects all that water. Then we have these electromagnetic fields and try and dissuade birds from going on it, or people, along with these electrostatic kind of thingies that will then dump a massive amount of zap into people if they ever try and climb on it. And technically you can get around it, but then it then uses electromagnetic pulses for those fields to then send electricity into whatever suit that they're wearing to try and ground themselves out, to then zap them on the inside as they are now the ground. So it really just tries to fucking say, stop going onto my ginormously expensive piece of machinery that you might damage and get yourself hurt, and then I have to deal with all of that shit, basically stopping all of it from moving, because this is a huge ass thing that takes a lot of energy. So stop it. Now, those charge fields and electromagnetics are as a result of the band gap, helpers for the solar panels. I know, right? Solar panels. But when you think about, like, this would be really amazing if you could make it longer and longer. And so, like, what do you know? That's a lot of electricity actually throughout the entirety, and it's only really kind of where one part is. And, like, this is a 15-mile long ginormous thing. You just put one next to it, and it's like, you know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of stuff. Like 5 Connex boxes tall and wide, 25 total square, and it's 50 miles long with the right little sliding lobster tail stuff that helps with, and the shape of the tube and all that to make the characteristics very good. Now, wait a second, it's not just solar panels. The pylons that you have to hold this sucker up with, because it's going to be heavy, and you're supposed to be able to move thousands of people, just like any cruise ship, basically, anywhere. Okay? And it's literally meant to be the version of anywhere can be traveled to fast, because this will go very fast to gain higher degrees of efficiency. About up to the Mach, slightly above Mach range, that's its highest efficiency characteristic. Because the speed of the pressure in the vessel, the lifting body characteristics, actually starts to really mean something. Going slower is a really stupid idea. You need faster. And that's why it's like, whoever said that this lifting body, just because it's big, and it's like, well, you need to go faster. You need to go faster. If you don't go faster, you don't get the effect as intended. That's really all it is. So that's what that is. But this one takes a lot of getting used to, because the inside is now also I can seal the system in the front and the rear, have air basically start to get compressed and push through a bunch of those props, which it now turns those into generators and air brakes and resistive force as it tries to do that. And then now I have like a bunch of coils and charge fields that are like, no, slow the F down, which tries to gain back a degree. Oh, looks like I'm having issues with my battery power for my hearing aids, which means you are listening to me on my regular unprocessed microphone, hopefully, still. All right, so, but we're going to go with, it recollects the vast majority of its energy. It's going to be, especially since it's a ginormous mass battery, like a flywheel, it's a mass battery. So once it gets up, it then has the ability to capture basically all of that energy, almost, back into the system that it was used to get it to move in the first place up to that speed. To maintain it only takes a certain amount of energy. So it gathers a great deal of that energy back that got it up to that speed. To maintain it, we not only use the solar panels, which are good and better and more efficient and all that stuff, but these pylons are sneaky. Remember my hydrothermal design? They are the radiator hydrothermal designs. That is what they are for. They are connected to ginormous hydrothermal heatsink things that have a basin of water that then uses the outside pressure with a thermoelectric generator and thermal photovoltaic generating materials that then like heat up the water behind it, as well with piezoelectrics, is because it's going to move around too from the train, but also just regular Earth movement stuff, you know. So then that also expands and contracts as the Earth heats and cools, because you're cooling it and you can heat it up, and respectively, as depending on how it is you want to do the movement of the thermal siphon that we're going to create. So as that pressure from the water above pushes it down, the expansion will expand into the center turbine area that is going to be vacuum sealed basically between the outer and inner sides of this cylinder, that then will be able to move off to other larger turbine central areas that then go into the, and so you get high pressure, medium pressure, and low pressure turbines that are set up now with the whole vacuum and all the rest of it, because why not gain that efficiency and compactness? But it's like those also, while spinning and everything and gain that efficiency, there's resistance. And so like those are really good at like keeping things going. We want resistance, we want torque value, and so like you have to change that into more of the fluid flow design, the hydraulic fluid flow for the turbine that we talked about a little earlier today, and then that allows for it to slow down, and then we use the Bernoulli's principle for a large basin of steam, and then slowly gets using convection sent upwards into a smaller area that then will allow for a greater degree of this efficiency effect from those other turbines being larger, and then all the rest of that, until eventually you get your waste heat generator radiator going as its final last hurrah on out to the air we are in. Okay, but then that also could genuinely be, hey, there you go, that's some hot water for you. Here's some hot water if you need it for some reason, which is also why it's like this goes through towns above it, because it's like that was a lot of good hot water that's now something you don't need to produce, with a lot of decent extra electricity that is able to be sent to your homes when the thing is not coming around. And remember, it takes sections, it builds up a battery. Or I didn't say that, but so I shouldn't say that, but like, yes, the structure has batteries built in to allow for, along with capacitors too, to dump in the area it needs to be in, so that way while it's not being used, it's just going to go be sent to your homes and everything else, and then it will slowly build up its battery reservoir of energy to then use the train when necessary. Now, you can use one that goes back and forth, but I then was like, yeah, well, two, I mean, since we're doing the thing like you, most likely, and then, I can do back and forth on both. So there's nothing saying I can't do that, Right, and then that gives, which again, this is 15 miles long of 5x5. Huge place, you know what I mean? Like, it's big. So it's like I can maintain a large degree. In fact, probably with all the efficiencies and everything else I have here, I can most likely fully run the train sustainably without having to use coal or any other extraneous degree of energy during its operation. Depending on the length of travel. Let's say it only traveled 5 miles, that's just what? It's 15 miles long. So let's go with like it traveled 300 miles. Jeez. Let's go with 300 miles here, and that's a fairly short travel now for what it's worth. That is going to get you there much faster. You're going at Mach, closer to the ground, less distance needs to be traveled. And you get most of the energy back. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean you built up that charge that you used on its way over to that, and if you want to go get it sent back, while you're still building up that charge because you drained, depending on the battery size and everything, a good amount, it will eventually overrun that. You have to generate a good amount of electricity. So it's like it all depends on the size and scope of this. So the larger the scale, the better it runs. So longer distance is what it's for. It's meant for these big cargo hauls or people just traveling like they're on a cruise ship around the whole world, that kind of thing. See, my original concept thought process was I can go from here in California, or where I'm at in Arizona, sorry, I live in Arizona, or here in America, and do a ring around America, and then through the heartland, kind of cross, UK flag kind of style, where it's an asterisk in the center. Um, then I'm able to then use the flying quadcopter designs basically to get me from that to somewhere in between, and then a hop, skip, and a jump basically, because I could probably walk or use a super hyper efficient any of the engines I've put out there already. Hell, even the turbine alone, basic bicycle with this turbine would probably give you a decent enough bit of travel distance there in its own right, because like a simple gas tank of hydrogen and a couple batteries and so on will most likely get you where you need to go within a solid 25 to 50 miles, I would imagine, so that's not bad. Besides, you got dropped off in a central hub that then sends you everywhere else. So that would be an easy enough way to go about that. And then crossing the ocean, which the pylons are really just like, sorry for oil tanker people out there that are not oil tanker, oil platform people. That's basically kind of what we're doing. We are going to sink something and then more or less use my concrete and my new concrete, structure stuff that's very resistant to corrosion from the ocean and ablation from the ocean as a result, because of all the rest of it. So we basically suck it in down, stick it in, you suck out some water, and it keeps the pressure in, that kind of thing. And then we build this in there slowly over time, and then we move on to the next one. And we have to dig in and make the hydrothermal. But now we have a bunch of water that we now had this wonderful salt, and I'm sure there's some carbon somewhere down there, So then there's the rest of the stuff that's around, usually calciums and magnesiums and lithiums and so on. So it's materials that we can then manufacture with a degree of good enoughness, accuracy, precision, consistency, with some 3D printer and manufacturing parts and equipment to then produce the batteries. Thermal electric generating, thermophotovoltaic generating materials, and the capacitors. The water, of course, can be filtered very significantly, so that way it's ready to go and be used. And then we have whatever else extra that we might need, which is likely to be able to continue the geothermal and waste heat generator, which now is going to go more or less to an air pump system. If I'm being really brutal about it, I have a central core that's going to be fed in air from the outside that then is going to be pushed through the radiator in a stack, more or less, because we can get closer to the mantle, all that heat that we're looking for. And then that gives us a greater degree of efficiency in the air that's much more prevalent in the surrounding area called the ocean, which is just kind of flat, wavy stuff, so not much resistance to faster air travel there, air speeds, wind speeds, that is. But why not use it for water and everything? Well, there's wildlife, and heat will be dissipated over time as clouds, steam, evaporation, but that also means we're dumping more heat into our hurricanes and so on and so forth, which we're not really wanting, more or less, to do. So typically I just sort of run it into the air, because the air is probably fine and good enough, and that'll be worthwhile for what it's worth. And then the solar panels will take over, and we can always run the standard blimp arrangement for windmills, for generating some electricity that can help cover some of the weight, almost like they're suspension bridges traveling between each pylon, by using buoyancy to help trade off some of the weight of the in-between pylon stuff. But of course we're not going to rely on that, just so everybody knows, because blimps do need to come down, blah blah blah. So but something, better than nothing, that kind of thing. But that allows for travel across the Pacific, across the Atlantic, and hemisphere, northern and southern as well. So look at this ginormous, huge tube that's now here for us over at nice, great, god damn it, I hate tourism. Sorry, I was going to go with Hawaii, but then I just realized, that's New Zealand, that's Australia, that's Japan, there's a lot of places. Because it's just so big in the sky. But it provides you guys with electricity, and I don't know what else to tell you. But for me, is we get these cool sky, crane thingies, little boxes, allow you to travel to the big, terminal that's then you're gonna that ship or shift you, carry you, I guess, into Hawaii, or probably just gonna be Hawaii or various islands that don't want to just make a solid structure, but even solid structure is kind of annoying, because it'll move and change somewhat, you know what I mean? So it's having that be able to be there with the cables, and you can change it, and sometimes that fails, but you still have the downward stair stuff into the ocean where you can just go on your boats. So that's a thing. I'm not ever gonna put this onto the island, because Hawaii is small, and I'm not doing that at all. Same thing with New Zealand, small. You know what I mean? But Australia and Japan, no, I will get up to there and basically just inject it. It's going to go into Africa and Madagascar, New Zealand, from New Zealand directly to, and then same thing to Japan. And it's going to go throughout Africa, and then same thing with the whole Eurasia thing, and then the Middle East. And then it's going to go across into Canada land, and the South America's all up in there. direct travel from all of the places anywhere you could really reasonably go from that, which is a large amount of solar panel use, by the way. So collecting a lot of electricity, and you're getting a lot of it back into the system, because you dump that like speed into electricity being pushed into the remainder of the tube, battery kind of capacitor setup. So, but you still have to maintain it, and truthfully, once you get to that level and that amount of connectivity, which means it's all able to support itself, it means that electricity is very ubiquitous. It's very easy to get from everywhere. And then it's like, oh, but we're not done because fiber optics and transceiver and receiver, antenna stuff for Wi-Fi, sharing, around the world. Same thing with power, to various degrees, either cables or wireless and so on and so forth, along with water, because we're collecting a great deal of water across the ocean, and it's really free of salt. So, then we can get some salt if we want salt, because it's still somewhat salty. So lots of salts everywhere, lots of good fresh water anywhere we want it, lots of electricity, lots of fiber optic communication lines everywhere, power to everything. So like that's kind of like the cell that I used in my mind, because it's like, look, I can transport all your goods anywhere as fast as you think you can reasonably get it, really quick, for large amounts and volumes. And I don't even send all of your workers there too. You want to build a ginormous city and town here? Oh yeah, I can do it. You know what I mean? So that kind of thing. To then it turned into like this also is sort of a bit of a pump, because like that water is like, oh, that's a decent way to get some of that energy back, instead of just trying to dump it into a heat soaked, probably gonna die capacitor battery resistor, setup system. So here's some water to help you out there, and then it's gonna spin your turbines and everything else, which is more electricity back into the system, but then that also helps pump water around, and then that turned into, hey, yo, remember that lake that's only showing up in Australia sometimes? Well, now you're a rainforest, Australia. Gonna give you a lake, and then here's a bunch of new clouds, because I have too much water, if I'm being honest. I have to evaporate quite a bit of it, and I have a bunch of surface area to do it on. And then, like, here you go, Africa. Here's lots of water and sewage treatment galore for, like, our one-pot method or whatever else you want to use. And then here's, all the batteries and capacitors and filters, because you can basically manufacture it off of the ultimate waste and, extra water and electricity and so on that you've got now. Same thing with everywhere, pretty much, it goes to, because it can be a fairly highly efficient pump, But again, it's one of those, like, well, how short of a distance, and it's like really dependent on the individuals, and their want of where they want it to travel through and what stops they want to allow for versus it just traveling through. You gotta remember, while it is in a tube, we're going to create the versions of those lifting body characteristics and, the electromagnetics and charge field and the pressure differentials, and it's dynamically opening it up and then sealing it off, basically with windows, more or less. So it allows air to flow through normally. And then that's also how we kind of just spray some of that extra water that we don't necessarily need back in. That's humidity, but then tends to just turn into clouds or condensation somewhere, But that allows for cooling effects and maintaining in altering the heat capacitance of a given area, and then rising thermals and a downdrafts, some marginal improvements in our, uh, you know, um, weather patterns going on. So helps out by putting water in storage areas like lakes and ponds and so on. But then we get more clouds, so beetle factor goes up. We're absorbing some of that heat into the water, which then allows for some of that albedo factor, as I just talked about. But then we also have water and sewage treated and electricity gain for pretty much most of the world. But it's as good as it is. It's still just a big old train setup, So you don't sell yourself short. I get you. I love that, but it's a not so much a work in progress. It's just like a kind of stop point. You can't really get better than a certain area that this is, and because it's sealed dynamically as it moves forward and everything, and then that vibration because you have the water and the spraying tends to help reduce sound and sound transfer especially with those vibrational diaphragmic designs that can help with the pressure fluid going through like a pump, but then also gaining a little bit of electricity as well with piezoelectrics and your turbines respectively. So, and then it also helps with pumping water into your hydrothermals a little more effectively and efficiently, which is good. Not terrible. It's actually really, really good. It's just it's still going to be fairly noisy. You know what I mean? It's a train. It's a ginormous train. You know what I mean? It's a 15-mile long train using lifting body characteristics that slightly above Mach to make it work really well. Which is good. I like it, but it is what it is, So, nothing too terrible. Honestly, car noise will be more impactful, and birds can now travel through the tubes. And then in the sealed system, and it's like, oh right, I need to get the hell out of this. I can't stay here. And you already have those little, like spiky whatever things as they come in. Right. So, but it's mostly just to be like, you can, go through. It's not going to disrupt any migratory or anything else. But then they're usually higher in the air, so it doesn't usually matter. But I'm thinking about wildlife and so on. That kind of thing. That's why I have the windows instead of sealing it completely. And it still allows for air to move through the system well, because the weather doesn't want to be affected that much, but I can slow it down in this area while giving it a little bit of a buffer of water, which tends to crash out some of that heat into the water, which then will go up and create those clouds, and then the downdraft cycle tends to help, downrange. And so, depending on how you do it with mountains and plains and so on, you can try and direct it to be a little better, more efficient in terms of rain and where you want, and sun where you want as well, and so on and so forth. It's good design. It was meant purely just for like brute force, high degree of efficiency of travel to and from around the world in any kind of where you want to go kind of stuff. Like a cruise ship, but also be ubiquitous in shared energy, like fiber optic internet, water, and all the rest of the cargo and all the rest of the stuff that comes along with that when it comes down to countries needing to move goods and people and services around. So everybody shares a little bit and everybody pays in, and so as a result, everybody gets the ability to use this, for their own personal meeting, travel stuff, but it comes at a reduced cost. If you pay outright, you can kind of just stay on the dang thing, like a cruise ship, living kind of arrangement, because they still has internet on the dang thing, working from home, so to speak. Eventually, I ended up realizing, I was like, oh yeah, no, that's going to be a pretty big one, because I have 5x5, 15 miles deep. So I was like, tens of thousands of people I could probably fit in these dang things. And I have two of them that can go back and forth. And so, yeah, I can move a lot. But then it's like mostly for cargo, because I only really want to move a couple thousand at most at any given time, to like maybe 5 at the most to economy travel, because it's like there's a way to like do this where I can kind of get it into the other tube and effectively still allow for it to move, just like we do with regular trains. And so as a result, it was like I have economy, which means I have 5,000, or what is it, 2,200, I think it was, or a little more, crammed into like one kind of passenger. Like crammed is decent enough way to put it. So it's 5x5 Connex, but instead of trying to get 2,200 people into it. So it's like we got hallways, people just there. You just kind of sit in your respective seat, and that's what you get. And there really isn't a place for you to kind of run around and enjoy. Then you've got like the cruise ship model, which like you have your kind of place where you're gonna sit and sleep and so on. And then you got your lounge kind of area, and you're outside like kind of window area. It's still just a window. Yeah, I have it sealed. I can't give you a. Oh yeah, no, we're traveling at Mach. Let me just poke you out there. I'm not gonna do that. So, that kind of thing. But that's kind of what it is. And then there's this is just for people versus like that's cargo and people now. You know what I mean? Because it's like I can get 2,200 in like a 5x5, when it's 5 deep. You know what I mean? It's like 5x5 square, but then you have the 5 deep rectangle, which I can get a couple thousand in there. I'm pretty sure. You know what I mean? Sure, you're not going to be probably super, super, super happy because you can just run around and stuff. But like, you still have space. Then like the passenger airplane guys, you know what? Let's remove some of that space. Let's get in 33. Let's try that. Nah, I'm done. That kind of thing. So I'm done on that. And then I have cargo for the remainder of the basically miles that we have. So it's like, there's got to be a way to make that work for me, And that turned into, there's passenger, now there's like huge cargo, and then there's like economy, and then like super economy, and then there's like luxury cruise stuff, that you kind of live on, that kind of thing. It's like you need to eventually come out for food and stuff. Well, you can kind of grow food on the darn thing, if I'm being honest. Dump your waste into like the sewage and everything else that's there because like you disconnected it. So you have like your deck that has amounts of soil, and you can always use your fecal matter and mix it and get your nutrients back a little bit. And so you can kind of get a lot of your food, but not everything. You need to get meat because people, and then I'm like, you're the vet that grows it. Lab grown. And so yeah, I know. See what I'm saying? That people genuinely see what I'm saying. Is like you can get chickens, you can get some of this stuff that means that you can make your own condiments and your own degrees of oils and uh, spices and herbs. And so it's 15 miles long, which turns into like actually a pretty damn good amount of farmland, truthfully. Cattle can definitely probably. Anyways, point is, you can do it. It's just not necessarily maybe what I think people might want. Maybe I don't know, but it was meant for people to be able to do that if they so chose to. But like we all decided to buy it. You know what I mean? Like, cause you like I'm the land. It's not really a landlord. No. But it's like I'm the citizen. Anyways, I'm the guy that owns the. Okay, but no, that'd be more of the track kind of thing, right? Yeah, but the company that runs it, right? Yeah. Right, anyways, point is that's that person, and then now you have a community that is for sure in the tens of thousands, which is a town, and decent sized town actually, right? That just constantly on a train that's just going to dump itself into wherever the hell it happens to want to stop. You know what I mean? Here's some tourism. God. The trainers are here. I'm laughing. I'm silently laughing if you don't know. I'm genuinely silently laughing because it's just like, what in the fuck is that? When I think about it, because it's not bad. It's a lot of them are self-contained, but it's like I want to visit this wherever the hell it is. Truthfully, which they vote where they're gonna dump themselves into together, because that's kind of fair, alongside of like all the rest of it. Then you have to get into like, oh yeah, no, the place, city or something that you're gonna dump this into. Oh, you're such a dick. At least with like, whatever military, when they come in for the port or even cruise ships, it's only a few thousand. Just definitely down in someplace. Yeah, well, good tourism. Here's a bunch of influx of money or whatever, but like, kind of hit the nail on the head for whatever it is. It's like, here's the trainers. It's the tour guide. And it's never-ending amounts of people. It seems like they just seem to show up. I've got 100 people stacked deep of my tour guide. Oh, good. Yeah, that kind of thing. Yeah. But anyways, it's a great system, I felt, for what it was worth. It's mostly just for moving cargo and a good amount of passenger people. Not really meant for creating towns, but you can do it. They're always moving, but then now I'm like, that's wasting kind of some of the energy to a point, But then you have the extra. So I don't, it's one of those things where I'm like, do it. It's fun. It's nice. And then went further with it when it turned into railgun coil stuff for helping send us to space easier off of like smaller contraptions, more or less. She's like, we got this tube. You can just sort of ride that, kind of a thing, and then whoosh, you kind of lift off, sort of effect, and then just go from there. That setup, more or less, but then that's kind of where the stopping point kind of hit, because I'm like, I don't really even want to do anything anymore. If I'm being honest, it was really rough past that point, because I was genuinely in the business of traveling between galaxies in superclusters with the faster than light tech I also have theorized should be there for the wormhole skin to the engine that allows for burning of exotic types of matter and energy collection. So, as a result, faster than light travel starts to happen more easily, which means, supercluster travel is now what we're doing versus intergalactic or universal sides, one side to the other, wherever it's gotten to, is basically what you'd be doing. Which then this technology is basically just to make any and all Earth-like planets easily turned into habitable planets, and then terraforming is really just using kind of the same engine design philosophies to terraform it over a good amount of time. That is not going to be terrible, and then we have the entirety of the universe at our disposal. Woo, we're done. Oh my god, thank goodness I'm finally finished. Yay. Let me fucking finally end this recording. I'm so tired. Oh my god. Food, I haven't eaten food.